volume 1 of the Zeteticism series, the Zetetic Eye Gyroscope. This is the second edition of volume 1. The first edition is currently being redone and will appear as a later volume of the Zeteticism series titled The Sunset. In the first part of this documentary, I will describe the Zetetic Eye model, showing why it is a possible explanation for the flat Earth system. And I will discuss how the Zetetic Eye model for flat Earth describes what is experienced on the surface of the Earth as gravitation, or the polar push of objects down to the Earth. And the Zetetic Eye model also describes the Earth's wind and ocean currents and patterns, the sunset, and more specifically how the ball of the sun can be seen to sink below the horizon according to the flat Earth model. Also how there can be star trails around a central point in two places in the sky. And the Zetetic Eye model for flat Earth developed in this video also would appear to have an explanation for the ocean tides. It is important to note that this model has not been presented before this time, so it is important to realize that this documentary should not be taken in the context of other flat Earth models. It is a theoretical model that will be presented in the first part of this documentary, and then empirical evidence will be presented for it in the second part of the documentary. The Zetetic Eye model consists of a sphere that is orbiting in a gyroscopic fashion, where the Earth is some sort of flat disk along the equator of that precessing gyroscope, where the center of the Earth appears to be right on the equator. Why would one believe this model? Firstly, as is discussed in great detail in some of the later volumes of this documentary series, it can be empirically verified that sundogs and moondogs are reflections off a spherical sky dome ceiling. These light reflections can only occur if the sky dome is smooth and perfectly spherical. So that much is known about the sky dome ceiling, and that one exists in the first place. The disk of the Earth is lodged below the equator of the gyroscopically rotating sphere. The best evidence for the idea that the Earth plane is smaller in diameter than the Zetetic Eye sphere, and thus rests in this dinner plate inside the basketball orientation we're discussing, is found in the inversion physics of sundogs, which is discussed in volume 3 of the Zeteticism series, where sundogs give very strong indication of being inverted light images, and that only can happen in a certain orientation of the plane of Earth with respect to the sky dome. The system forms a shape that is like an eyeball viewed from the side, hence the name the Zetetic Eye Gyroscope model for flat Earth. I will sum up the Zetetic Eye Gyroscope model in a few sentences here, and then we will go into it in great detail before the empirical evidence for it is presented later in the documentary. Most simply put, the Zetetic Eye Gyroscope involves the idea that the Earth system is analogous to a small dinner plate resting inside of a basketball or a beach ball. The Zetetic Eye sphere spins with a gyroscopic precessional oscillation, and the Earth plane is situated on the inside of the sphere such that the center of the Earth would lie along the equator of the Zetetic Eye sphere. As the spinning and precession occurs, that gives rise to a centrifugal force, which is misrepresented as the force of gravity. Also, the precession of that gyroscopically rotating sphere gives rise to ocean and wind currents as well as tides. In this system, the Earth would be lodged firmly on the inside of the sphere, not moving from its position, but the entire sphere with the Earth fixed to the side would turn. One point to revisit about this model that seems to be incredibly important if this model turns out to be correct is the idea that the Earth plane's diameter is smaller than the diameter of the Zetetic Eye Gyroscope. As you will see, this specific issue could give a zetetic explanation for the illusion of curvature on the surface of the Earth, such as when you're looking at the Chicago skyline from the beach in Michigan, where the skyline of Chicago appears lowered on the horizon. The Zetetic eye gyroscope model has an explanation for that, which very clearly shows that this would be a product of light refraction in the Zetetic eye gyroscope system. If the Zetetic eye gyroscope system is correct, it would give the illusion of curvature. It is important to be very clear in understanding that this is a different scenario of light refraction of light traveling across the surface of the Earth than is discussed by professional academics, who hold that light refraction has a quite small effect with light traveling over the surface of the horizon, and what has a large effect is the curvature of the Earth, and that is why objects appear lower on the horizon. Many will be surprised to learn that this is actually not verifiable empirically. In other words, when we see objects lowered in the distance on the horizon, such as you're seeing in your screen now with the Chicago skyline, the buildings being lower on the horizon than they appear when one is up close. If one asks the question, is that curvature or is that a trick of light? It is not verifiable, to my knowledge, in professional academia, which is the case. In this and other volumes of this documentary series, we will find very strong evidence that lowering of objects on the horizon is a product of light refraction, but of a different sort than professional academics discuss. We will cover this in more detail later in the documentary and in later volumes of this series. This is a central issue in the Zetetic eye model, so I would like to be very clear. When one looks out onto the horizon, at distances of 15 miles and more, objects will appear lower on the horizon than they would be expected to be. This is ubiquitously deemed to be a product of the curvature of the Earth. However, if NASA information is discarded, perhaps for the reason because it is by definition non-scientific information, since it cannot be verified by the average citizen of the world, but it is only by NASA's information that we supposedly have a direct verification that the Earth is a sphere. This information is typically called scientific, but due to the fact that it is not verifiable by the average person, it is non-scientific information. And for that very reason, human knowledge to this point in history does not contain an empirical proof that the lowering on the horizon is due to the curvature of the surface of the Earth, rather than, for example, some sort of light bending, or that is, light refraction. It is well known how light can play tricks on us, so to speak, and make objects appear in different places than they are, and greatly distort objects right in front of our very eyes. Most of this we are completely used to because we see it so often in our daily life that it becomes almost unnoticed. So to explore the idea that the objects on the horizon that appear lowered are doing so because of light seems to be completely straightforward and even mandatory study to undertake. And there is so much light distortion going on the horizon that it would almost be surprising if there was not a distortion of some sort. We will find out in this documentary series, in the simplest of empirical terms, demonstrated for you in these documentary films, that the lowering of objects on the horizon, which is considered to be a product of the curvature of the Earth, is only a trick of light bending to make objects progressively further in the distance on the horizon appear lower. It is widely discussed by academics how objects appear raised in appearance in the sky due to light refraction, but down very near the horizon this switches and light is refracted in the opposite direction and objects appear artificially lower. This will be discussed in great detail in a moment. In this documentary and places in the Zeteticism documentary series, I will refer to what is typically considered the Southern Hemisphere by the name the SH ring, which just means Southern Hemisphere ring. The point is to give these new names that can be used in flat earth research that don't refer to spherical objects, namely hemispheres, and the inner circle there will refer to as the NH inner circle. The Zetetic eye system having the diameter of the earth plane smaller than the diameter of the Zetetic eye system also would explain the sunset, among a number of other issues, including gravitation. So this issue of the earth plane having a smaller diameter is a very important issue. To reiterate, the only evidence I know that it is comes from sundogs. One piece of evidence was just presented for why it's believed that sundogs reveal that the earth plane is lower than the equatorial level of the Zetetic eye sphere. But there is a second piece of evidence for sundogs revealing that the Earth plane is oriented in this way, such as you're seeing in your screen now. And that comes also from volumes 2 and 3 of this documentary series, where it was shown by experimentation that apparently sundogs can only be created as a reflection off the back of the sky dome ceiling. But if the Earth plane was at the equatorial level, or even closer to the sky dome ceiling, above the equatorial level, sundogs would not be possible right on the horizon. The proper orientation of observer, sun, and sky dome ceiling that has the back of the sun reflected off of it, creating the sundog halo, cannot be achieved from these orientations. The plane of the Earth must be below this equatorial level, as you're seeing on your screen, in order for sundogs to exist on the equator as is readily seen from Earth. This would appear to be a second piece of evidence that sundogs show that the Earth plane is below the sky dome ceiling, which is verified empirically to be spherical if the sundog analysis in volumes 2 and 3 and others after those 2 volumes in this documentary series is correct and empirically sound, revealing that sundogs are actually reflected light off the sky dome ceiling. If that empirical study is correct, then we know one very important element of the physical system that we live within, and that is that we have a spherical, incredibly smooth sky dome ceiling, which the Earth appears to exist in the following sort of orientation you see on your screen right now, including having an embowed flat plane surface, which is caused by the centrifugal force of the Zetetic gyroscope system being what is actually referred to as gravity. Sundog parhelix sky halos compose one of the first pieces of strong evidence for this Zetetic gyroscope system being proposed in this video documentary. A second piece of evidence will be the empirical discovery that the Earth is some sort of a flat or approximately flat plane, which will be uncovered in several of the volumes of this documentary series, including a very important discussion of how Mount Tanupa outside the Salar de Uyuni in South America shows that the Earth's apparent curvature is only the result of the trick of light refraction. Next, I am going to play a clip of the first draft of the Zetetic eye model. This clip will help us explain much more of the Zetetic eye gyroscope. We would like to bring up the theory that the Zetetic eye sphere is turning. In the picture you see on your screen, you're looking at the Earth plane as it is level. The red arrow indicates the direction of spin. There would be an axis through the center of the expanse parallel to the Earth plane. If this entire sphere spun to a sufficient degree, it would produce a centrifugal force which would be indistinguishable from gravity. It may seem ad hoc to state that the overall sphere is turning in this way. However, we do know that something is turning in the sky because we see the Earth turning with respect to stars. So therefore there is turning motion going on. There are 4 views, to my knowledge, for how you can have gravitational-like behavior at the surface of the Earth where things fall downward. One is free fall. Free fall, however, would not appear to be applicable to this situation since it already presumes something is pulling the object free falling. So free fall would appear to reduce to the other descriptions of gravitation-like motion of objects down towards the surface of the Earth. Another answer is centrifugal force, as we have just given and we'll further elaborate on in a moment. Third is an invisible, unseen metaphysical force that objects with mass to one another exhibit. This is the view currently held by professional academia since Isaac Newton. And lastly, there's the idea that the Earth is being accelerated upward. To my knowledge, this is the view that the Flat Earth Society holds. I know very little about the Flat Earth Society, if anything at all, and I do not know much about this view, but we will discuss it first and find it as problematical. The upward motion of the Earth plane to create a gravitation-like downward motion of objects towards the surface of the Earth, what we call falling, would have to be an acceleration, not a velocity. If it was a continual velocity, in other words, an unchanging speed, then objects would just have their specific momentum, p equals mv, and the velocity there, v, would be constant, and so would m, so p, which equals mv, would be a constant, not a derivative. In other words, not a changing value. This would be analogous to if you were in a camper and you and I were playing with a ball, throwing it back and forth. The ball, once I threw it to you, would not suddenly hit the back of the camper because of the velocity of the camper going 70 miles an hour down the highway. It would appear from the inside of the camper, if a silent camera was taken of the scene, one would not be able to verify if the camper is moving or not, assuming the camper was traveling on a smooth road. The ball stays right with us as if we are stationary on the surface of the earth, because all objects, two people and single ball, have the same velocity in their P equals mv equation. Therefore, the upward motion would have to be accelerating. It would have to be a derivative or a changing value. Those who hold to the speed of light barrier will instantly see a problem with this due to the fact that it will not take very long for the upward motion of the plane to reach the speed of light barrier and exceed it, which is supposedly, in some theoretical circles, viewed as being impossible. I will not make a comment on this either way, and I will avoid this issue. I just wanted to bring it up as a side note. So the upward plane would continually have to accelerate its motion in order to account for displacement of objects. If the camper suddenly puts on its brakes, the ball will go forward and possibly the people will as well, because the orientation of speeds and objects and their positioning with respect to one another has changed. This is what the gravitation-like motion of objects moving down toward the surface of the earth, called falling, exhibits and involves. Some may note that the speed of light barrier might not be violated because if there was nothing outside of the sky ceiling sphere that the earth is fixed within, then there would be nothing that the expanse, the sky sphere, is traveling with respect to, so the speed of light barrier would not be broken. However, that is even more problematical because in order for there to be acceleration, there has to be at least two objects moving with different orientations with respect to one another, and if there's nothing outside the sky sphere, then it is not in motion. Therefore, the sky sphere on the Flat Earth Society's model of an upward acceleration would have to be traveling through some sort of medium outside of the sky sphere in order that the sky sphere overall could be moving to thus create the gravitational acceleration experience, to thus create the gravitation-like downward falling of objects toward the surface of the earth. Note that for this reason, the Flat Earth Society's upward acceleration explanation for gravitation-like behavior relies on a metaphysical, unseen entity existing outside of the sky sphere, and it would appear it may be impossible to verify or de-verify that it exists. As discussed a moment ago, the acceleration would increase without end, and as the sky sphere traveled through this unknown metaphysical medium outside of it, with the incredible accelerations that would build through time, it is hard to believe that the sky sphere would not be deformed by this tremendous motion it exhibited through the metaphysical medium it travels within. But if it is deformed, it's hard to believe that it could maintain enough of its structural integrity to maintain a spherical or approximately spherical structure required for the sky dome to exist and allow us to see the sun dogs and moon dogs reflected off its spherical walls. It will be the opinion of this filmmaker that it is a better move to abandon this upward acceleration for the multiple problems that are mounting that we have listed to do with this position, and it is better to simply move along with the documentary with the only position left that is non-metaphysical and which has an empirical basis, which is the centrifugal force of the spinning sky sphere, as discussed moments ago. If the Zetetic eye sky dome was turning, it would mimic a scenario where one had a rock in a bucket, a string tied to the bucket handle, where one whirled it through the air in a circle, and wherein the rock would stay fixed and unmoving to the bottom of the bucket if the bucket was whirled with sufficient speed. The rock would try to push through the bottom of the bucket. If the bucket material was flimsy enough, and if the centrifugal of the turning rock was sufficient enough, it could break through the bucket, mimicking something falling hard to earth and breaking the surface. These mechanics are indistinguishable from gravity. For these reasons, gravity is better described not as a metaphysical connection between material objects, a metaphysical force of unknown nature between objects. The gravitation-like effect, which is really centrifugal force, according to the turning Zetetic eye model, would actually rather be a push rather than a pull. This seems to be a more empirical way to describe gravitation-like effects than the academic view. This is why for years in my teaching I would describe gravitation to students as only a motion, a tendency for objects of mass to move towards each other in specific ways. I would never describe gravitation as being an attraction, because that involves a metaphysical description. However, the turning Zetetic eye model avoids metaphysics and only describes the gravitation-like effect as a motion of objects to move along the centrifugal force of motion. However, the turning Zetetic eye model avoids metaphysics and only describes the gravitation-like effect as a motion of objects to move along the centrifugal force of motion. So that is one aspect of the proposed motion of the entire Zetetic eye sphere. However, there's no reason to believe that the sphere perfectly spins on a horizontal axis parallel to the surface of the Earth at the center of the sphere. It could also have a twisting motion as well. This would perhaps be expected, since a spinning sphere will form a gyroscopic motion, as is seen in so many of the celestial bodies in the heavens, such as the moon and sun and so forth. So it would not be surprising if there was a twisting, as well as you're seeing in your screen here with the bicycle wheel. With those theoretical descriptions just given of the proposed Zetetic eye gyroscope system, let's now explore some of the empirical evidence for this system. On your screen is a list of some of the points that the Zetetic eye gyroscope model would apparently explain. Let's first discuss the sunset. I will only discuss it briefly in this volume, since in a later volume of this Zeteticism series, there will be an episode specifically devoted only to the sunset, which will divulge far more detail than I will in this introductory analysis of the sunset for the flat earth model, the Zetetic eye gyroscope. In analyzing the sunset, we first must note that it is empirically verifiable that the sun is very low, only on the order of thousands of miles in altitude, rather than tens of millions of miles away from the surface of the Earth. As is well known, professional scientists worldwide do not hold this position, and they hold the other position just mentioned, that the sun is tens of millions of miles away. Which position is correct can only be settled by the simplest and most straightforward of empirical evidence that supports one of the two positions. Both positions, of course, cannot be correct, so empirical evidence will stack up in favor of one position and not in the other. To my knowledge, it is not possible for a person to verify with their own eyes, scientifically, empirically, that the sun is tens of millions of miles away. However, it is empirically verifiable by any person on Earth who has a cell phone or a camera to verify that the sun is extremely close, on the order of thousands of miles in altitude. The position held by professional scientists worldwide, which involves the concept that the sun's distance from the surface of Earth can be calculated by radar studies to do with the transit of Venus, will be discussed at great length in the future volume of the Zeteticism series that was just mentioned, where it will be found that that analysis of determining the distance of Venus from the surface of the Earth by radar analysis, and then further finding the sun distance from that Venus transit distance calculation, does not hold the scientific, or more specifically Zetetic, rigor, analysis, and empiricism that the flat earth position holds, that many flat earthers discuss. What I'm specifically referring to is that anybody with a cell phone or a camera can verify that the sun changes its size significantly upon rising and setting, and where it maintains a roughly similar size on most days across more overhead portions of the sky. This is precisely how the sun would behave according to the flat earth model, and it is an absolute dire contradiction to the heliocentric model. To my knowledge, most heliocentric opponents of this idea state that the sun's size cannot be calculated to change at setting or rising because the sun is rayed, thereby hiding the spherical surface of it, which is needed to measure the size of the sun. However, that appears to be a non-empirical assertion which should be disregarded, because as you're seeing on your screen now, at rising and setting is specifically the time when the sun loses its rayed appearance on many days. This is caused by the atmosphere and also can happen during the day, as you're seeing on your screen now, in a picture that the filmmaker took shortly before the publication of this volume of this documentary series. So we have a very straightforward empirical analysis that anybody can reproduce in their backyard with a cell phone camera showing that the size of the sun changes upon setting and rising. This is, of course, absolutely impossible in the heliocentric model because it would involve the idea that on the order of minutes in the rising and setting of every day, the sun gets perhaps 40, 50, 60% larger and smaller in size when it's rising and setting respectively, which would mean that the Earth would have to get that much closer or further from the sun on the order of minutes, which of course does not happen according to the heliocentric model, where the sun is expected to keep a consistent size and changes in size will be extremely gradual over the course of weeks. The heliocentric model apparently would not have an explanation for this phenomenon of the shrinking and growing in size of the sun. This shrinking and growing is clearly not a product of light diffraction or, of course, not of light refraction either. And while atmosphere could act as a lens, the orientation of the atmosphere and how the sun rises and sets on the heliocentric model would not involve shrinking and growing of the size of the sun in the way seen in the sky. The filmmaker is unsure, but it appears a remote possibility that atmosphere structure, according to the heliocentric model, could amount to growing and shrinking of the size of the sun. But the problem is they are doing it in the wrong order. The sun should shrink upon rising. The sun would spread out, according to the heliocentric model, as sunlight entered the atmosphere, passing the convex surface of the atmosphere of the Earth. That means the thicker the atmosphere, the more refracting and lens-like enlarging of the size of the sun would happen. So in other words, the sun should be at its largest on rising and at its smallest when it's overhead, and then return to its largest size upon setting. However, this is specifically not what happens. The opposite scenario happens. So the heliocentric model, if it could even be theorized that the nature of the atmosphere produces a lensing effect of the sun as sunlight passes through the atmosphere to the surface of the Earth, it is specifically in direct contradiction with the actual way that light refracts through convexity. Let's now proceed to attempt to describe the mechanics of the sunset. As you've probably noticed, the Zetetic eye model involves a gyroscopic top-like spinning, which would push atmosphere to the two ends to be the thickest at the outer edges due to centrifugal force, which would perfectly mimic gravity. This would be the reason for air pressure, such as what we see in our Earth plane reality here in our daily lives in the physical realm. And this would of course also be why one experiences symptoms of lessening atmosphere when one travels to the top of a mountain. Please note that the Zetetic eye gyroscope model of physical earthly reality and heliocentrism are in agreement in that air pressure increases and air density increases the closer one is to the surface of the Earth. Of course, the heliocentric model claims that is due to gravity, and the Zetetic eye gyroscope model due to centrifugal force. This leads to another absolutely critical point that both the heliocentric model and the Zetetic eye gyroscope model are in agreement on, and that is the simple, empirically verifiable datum that light bends into density. Put in simpler terms, what was said is that if light travels through a medium where densities shift in that medium, such as through glass or water or any other medium that light travels through, if density increases where the light is traveling through, the light will turn to the direction of that density. In other words, if light is coming in from the sun down to the surface of the Earth, that light will travel through increasing levels of atmospheric density, wherein the light will curl downward, as you're seeing on your screen now. As stated, this is a very well-known empirical datum, which any of us can verify just by simply sticking your hand in the water when you're swimming in a swimming pool and seeing how your arm appears to bend when going into the water. Here's a picture of underneath the water looking out into the air. This would mimic the heliocentric model. Notice that underneath the water, the railings appear higher than they do outside of the water. That is because light has been bent downward toward the density of the water, and the bending of light makes the objects whose images are carried as pictures in the light to one's eyes change their orientation because the light direction in bending has changed. So the objects in the higher density appear raised in appearance to the images of the railing outside of the pool. This is all that is meant by light refraction and light bending downward, making objects appear higher in the sky than they actually are. In a future volume of this documentary series, there will be footage from aircraft as they're taking off from the surface of the Earth and traveling to a very high cruising altitude in order to try to empirically detect the effects of light refraction and how objects appear at different locations than they actually are. So to reiterate, the heliocentric model and the Zetetic eye gyroscope model both agree on the following data points. There is some sort of force that is pulling air down to create increasing air density towards the surface of the Earth. Point 2, that air density results in light refraction. Point 3, that light refraction makes objects in the sky appear higher than they actually are. At this point, things with respect to the sunset appear to be roughly explained according to heliocentrism. Objects in the sky will appear higher than they actually are, such as the sun, but nevertheless, according to heliocentrism, the Earth will still turn and the sun will set. But on the scenario that we have a low sun over a flat, slightly embowed plane, there are a couple more factors to consider. And if one does consider those, one will see that a sun in the far distance will involve a setting in its appearance on the Earth plane. This is partly due to perspective, as has been so widely discussed by flat earthers in the present and also deep in the past. But also there is a flip in the light refraction and the direction that light points, and a flip in the bending of light at a certain point when the sun reaches a far distance, and perspective brings the sun and the Earth plane relatively close to each other in appearance. In other words, the heliocentric model involved a setting sun, even if curvature did not create that appearance according to the heliocentric theory. So the sun in a flat Earth system and the sun in a heliocentric system act in surprisingly similar ways. Another example of this, and another way the two models are in agreement, the Zetetic eye model and the heliocentric model, is that the sun appears to move faster right at sunset. Time-lapse footage shows, and is well known even among professional scientists. Take a look at this clip right here. We see the sun coming up. Let's divide this clip into two halves. Each will be 1.53 seconds. Let's look at the first clip. The sun moves in its appearance at that distance. Now let's look at the second clip. And in the second 1.53 seconds of that time-lapse footage, the sun moves in its appearance at that distance. So compare the two, put them next to each other, look at these distances, and we can see that the sun velocity was greater as the sun's appearance of its distance from the horizon was greater the lower it was in its appearance in the sky. Now take the first half of the footage that we just watched and do the same thing again, divide it in two parts to look at the first and the second half. Here's the first half, and you can see the sun changed its appearance in the sky by this much. Now take the second half, and you can see that the sun changes in its appearance by that much. Look at the two distances next to each other, and you see the sun has a greater change in its apparent distance from the horizon lower in the sky. So this would imply there's a progressive increase in the appearance of the sun closer to the horizon. In other words, as if it's moving and setting faster as it gets closer to the horizon. This is very nicely explained by the flip and refraction. If one is viewing the sun as it moves further and further away in appearance in the sky from one, the angle at which sunlight approaches the observer decreases as the sun's appearance recedes. This will amount to the artificially raised in appearance sun due to refraction, however continuing to lower in its appearance in the sky closer to the horizon. This is quite easily mimicked and is just simply an exercise of perspective. It appears that the sunset is a result of a trick of light when the sun reaches a certain point in perspective in the distance, which will be explained next and which will explain the sunset in a flat Earth model. As the sun recedes from one in its appearance in the sky, eventually there is a last ray of light carrying the picture information of the sun that will reach the observer on the surface of the Earth. This is because the angle of light of the sun will eventually reach zero. At this point, light will approach a person bent in the opposite direction, which will make the sun appear artificially lower than it actually is in the sky. It appears it is at this point that the sun speeds up in its direction, because it is going through a passage of where it is artificially raised in appearance in the sky to artificially lowered in appearance in the sky. The observer on the Earth plane will witness the appearance of the sun going from higher than it actually is to lower, a passage and transition that it did not exhibit an overhead in the sky, and as it approaches that transition point. At the transition point, it has to move faster in its appearance, wherein after which light beams approach bent upward, since sunlight after this point of changeover travels from sunball to observer through a lessening density of atmosphere, wherein light will be bent upward. Specifically how this happens will be discussed in detail in just a moment. When light bends upward in this fashion, the sun appears lower than it actually is. And if you follow the line from the observer at point X that you see in your screen right now, you'll notice that the sun direction, as indicated by the bent refracted light, points into the ground. In other words, the sun will appear to have sunk below the horizon line. This changeover in refraction from being bent downward and appearing higher in the sky, and then we're either right at the horizon or somewhere very close to it, the changeover occurs where the sun appears lower than it actually is in the sky due to the light being bent upward. This is the key to understanding how the sunball can sink beyond the horizon, and this will be discussed in much more detail over the next few minutes. As stated, this phenomenon happens in both heliocentric and Zetetic eye flat Earth models. When the sun passes the transition point of appearing artificially raised in the sky, moving into the artificially lowered appearance in the sky, what is happening is light is refracting in a different direction, going upward instead of downward, which makes objects appear lowered in their appearance. This is readily seen in routinely conducted classroom experiments of light refraction through slabs of glass or plastic and so forth. When light travels into the glass, it bends into the direction of the density. But look on the other side, when it retreats from the glass, it resumes its original direction because it's back to the original density of medium that it is traversing through. Light acts very predictably in varying density mediums. When the sun has passed the critical point in the distance, where it is refracting light upward and making the sun appear artificially lowered in its appearance, one is viewing the sun through a thickening density. In other words, where one's eye is as to where the sunbeam is released from the sun that enters one's eye when one is observing sunlight at sunset. The sunbeam is released in a more dense air patch than where the eye is. So the trajectory of light from the sun to the observer, which is light carrying the picture information from the sun to the observer, is traveling through decreasing density, the opposite scenario of when the sun was artificially raised in appearance in the sky, when it was closer to the observer. So just as with the optics experiment with the slab of glass, light will move in the opposite direction as when light entered into the more dense glass medium. This is precisely what is happening at the changeover point of the sun far in the distance. A perhaps much better way to describe this phenomenon, and which is in very different words than just given for the sake of better understanding, is as follows. Flat Earth involves the idea of a low sun traveling across the sky. As the sun travels further and further, it approaches its perspectival vanishing point. Notice I said it approaches its vanishing point. It never actually arrives at it because it's refracted downward in its appearance beforehand, as just stated. The flat Earth model should involve a sun vanishing point at the horizon. The sun stays in its same height range as it retreats from the observer on the Earth plane, but due to the law of perspective, which is so heavily discussed by flat earthers, the distance observed as the sun retreats between the sunball and the Earth plane horizon decreases until it gets to the point of nearly zero. Put in simplest terms, as the sun decreases in distance from the observer by perspective, the angle at which the sun appears to the observer decreases as stated until it eventually reaches a 0 point where the angle has diminished to nothing. We can call this the zero angle, or where the sun is level with the observer in appearance by perspective. At this point, the sun is not refracted up or down. It is exactly where it appears in the sky. And any distance it travels beyond this, it will be refracted in the opposite direction, and therefore will appear lower and will set below the horizon. If there were no light refraction, the sun would continue to retreat and retreat further. And it is unclear exactly when and if the sky can become darkened and the sun can retreat fully from view, due to the fact that actual vanishing points are located at infinity. The point is that the observer on the Earth plane eventually views the sun as if it was very near the horizon, simply due to the law of perspective and a low traveling sun, according to the flat Earth philosophy. This is the very same thing as the train tracks meeting in the distance. The train tracks are actually parallel, but in appearance are non-parallel, and if they are non-parallel, they therefore, in appearance only, must falsely appear to almost touch on the horizon. Of course, this is an optical illusion, just as the sun nearing the horizon is an optical illusion, but nevertheless, the way light travels from either railroad tracks on the horizon or setting sun near the horizon is delivered to the observer as if entities which are traveling parallel to one another are nearing and touching. It is at this point where the zero angle is reached, with the sun's light reaching the observer, at some point either at or near the horizon. Again, the zero angle is when the sun is no longer refracted downward where its appearance is shifted upward, and instead the sun appears exactly where it is for just an instant. This, of course, happens before the vanishing point at infinity, due to the fact that, of course, infinity is much further, in fact, is infinitely far away, whereas the sun is finitely far away, viewed in the distance near the horizon. So the sun keeps moving, even though it has reached what we are calling the zero angle, level with the observer, appearing right where it is in the sky, not refracted. But if the sun keeps moving, then the only possible way it can move with respect to the observer is where it is refracted in the opposite direction, since it has changed over from being refracted downward to upward, and therefore going from appearing artificially raised to artificially lowered, and the sun ball right near the horizon, in appearing artificially lowered, will sink below the horizon. This is what accounts for the sunset. It is simply a trick of light refraction through the density of the atmosphere as the sun ball nears the vanishing point but is refracted downward below the horizon before the vanishing point is reached. The second important point into understanding how the sunset occurs on the Zetetic eye gyroscope model is that sunlight appears across an embowed Earth plane. This is really probably the central point in understanding the sunset on the Zetetic eye gyroscope model. And it also will lead to the conclusion that any object viewed sufficiently far in the distance on the horizon will be artificially lowered in appearance, giving rise to the illusion of curvature of the Earth, since progressively further in the distance, more and more lowering will happen. As you can see from the diagram on your screen right now, as distance increases between object viewed in the distance on or near the horizon and the observer viewing the specific object, the viewer will view the object through a lessening density due to the orientation of object and observer of object. This will not take effect except when objects are near the horizon or at the horizon. But as stated already, if an object is viewed through lessening density, it will be refracted upward and therefore appear artificially lower. On a slightly embowed Earth plane, any object sufficiently far in the distance will appear artificially lowered. And really just this simple second point here in our keys to understanding the sunset model will account for the setting sun and the appearance of objects lowering in the horizon in the distance, such as the Chicago skyline viewed from Michigan. This also means that the aforementioned zero angle will appear a bit higher in the sky than may be initially guessed. Nevertheless, the filmmaker believes that the zero angle is very near the horizon, but no conclusion as to specifically where it is will be made in this documentary. In the first edition of Volume 1 of Zeteticism, it was found that lowering of objects in the distance on the horizon did not reach a significant observable effect until 15 to 20 or even 25 miles away, where a large jump in the amount of lowering of objects in the distance and the horizon and their appearance took effect. The filmmaker could have had errors or mistakes in that analysis leading to that, but it did seem to be the case that that was quite consistent. And it would appear to be the case that that is where the embowment would take effect in making objects appear artificially lowered. The filmmaker is of the belief that one could actually calculate the slope of the embowment of the flat Earth plane with this information. However, no such attempt to do so will be made in this documentary. While all three of the points listed in the keys to understanding the sunset are viewed as critically important, this second point is probably the most important one and the one that makes the sunset most understandable. In addition to making the lowering of objects in the distance on the horizon artificially appear lower, also most understandable. Now let's move to the last point. The next critical point to understand as we explain the sunset is that the land one is viewing in the distance from observer to horizon also will undergo significant lowering further and further out from the observer. I first noticed this when I was studying the Chicago skyline, where I noticed that the water that made up the line of the horizon very clearly was not the water that was at the shore of Lake Michigan in Illinois at the Chicago skyline. Rather, it seemed to be much closer in appearance, whereas the Chicago skyline seemed very far in comparison. I could clearly make out waves horizontally across my view, so that water seemed to be empirically verifiable as being much closer than the Chicago skyline. Well, that's because there's a certain point beyond which land or water is not viewable because the light is refracted. Because, as with the sunset just discussed, the light is being viewed directly across the horizon, where the greatest density of atmosphere is, and those same processes right at the horizon, which make the sun ball appear to sink below the horizon, are also in play here with the Chicago skyline. But also with the land or water that makes up the horizon, where further in the distance more refraction occurs, and progressively objects are refracted more and more, appear artificially lowered more and more across the embowed Earth plane below the zero angle, where objects closer in the distance will block out objects further in the distance as the objects further are lowered. According to the Zetetic eye model, it is theorized that the Earth plane is actually embowed, meaning that it has some bowing of the surface approximately along the curve of the inside of the Zetetic eye sphere. There are a number of reasons for believing this is the case. One, if the Zetetic eye gyroscope model is correct, then the centrifugal force, which is actually what gravity is, would come down on the surface of the Earth not in an exactly perpendicular manner if the Earth plane was perfectly geometrically flat rather than with a slight embowment. Also, it appears an embowed surface will facilitate a better rotation and spin of the Zetetic eye gyroscope and keep it from being lopsided. The dome in the opposite direction of rotation will have to be thicker in the central regions than it is in the outer regions. In other words, nearer the spin axis, it will be a thinner dome than it will be at the equatorial region perpendicular to the spin axis, in order to also compensate for the extra weight that the Earth plane involves at the equatorial region. It's very important to note that this idea that the central region of the dome is thicker than the outskirts is apparently a theoretical notion, and evidence for it is not developed at this point, although it could be in the future perhaps. But the important point to note about this is if the central region is thicker and if the dome is transparent, it could mean that any objects seen through the dome are inverted in appearance, as the dome would comprise a positive meniscus, and anything below the center of curvature, in other words below the spin axis of the Zetetic eye gyroscope, such as where the Earth plane is, would find the objects outside the dome inverted in their optical appearance. But this is a theoretical point, so let's leave this now and continue our more empirical analysis. The embowment also describes a few other interesting issues, such as, for example, why Ushuaia in South America at the very tip of the continent has such a prolonged amount of sunlight on its longest days of the year. If the Earth was a perfectly flat plane, this would not be possible. However, with the embowment correlating with the inner of the Zetetic eye gyroscope sphere means that Ushuaia is actually far closer to the sun than is the case when Ushuaia is viewed as being on the outskirts of a geometrically flat plane. Instead, on an embowed plane, Ushuaia is that much closer to the sun and will experience much more sunlight than expected. Furthermore, Ushuaia will receive a smaller amount of light refraction due to its orientation to the sun than cities typically will on the Earth plane. In other words, light that travels from the sun to Ushuaia, if Ushuaia is elevated as you're seeing on your screen now on the Earth plane, will receive a much smaller amount of light refraction than a city more towards where the arrow is pointing. This will lead to a longer time until the sun sets in the distance. And furthermore, if one extends further to the edge, looking at the orientations of sunlight directions that you see on your screen now, it's possible that there will be no refraction or a inverse refracting where light will bend upward, thus allowing light from the sun to perpetually reach the edges when the sun is furthest towards the edge of the Zetetic eye gyroscope's Earth plane. In other words, when it's winter in the northern hemisphere or the NH inner circle and summer in the SH outer ring. This could explain how Antarctica could have 24 hours of sunlight for multiple months during the year, if in fact Antarctica and its 24-hour sunlight is in reality as we have been told it is. Astonishingly few people of Earth have verified the existence of Antarctica, and its existence does not comprise a comfortable level of scientific information, and therefore using it to make any conclusions in this documentary would be careless. So we'll leave the theorization of Antarctica sunlight as it is. The Earth plane being embowed is still considered by the filmmaker to be a zetetic or flat Earth model, because although the Earth plane would involve a slope, that slope only consists of a very small amount of the sphere, and thus airline pilots, even on very long flights, such as from the United States to Japan, would travel across a varying altitude if the plane was moving in a straight line with respect to the Earth plane and the embowment. However, over those long distances, only slight corrections for altitude would be needed by an airliner. And so if jetliners do have such auto-correcting or manually correcting mechanisms for altitude, they would not be disruptive and significant, and thus may not draw the attention of heliocentric-minded pilots. To the filmmaker's knowledge, the only corrections or adjustments that pilots regularly make to flight altitude is a lowering of the altitude of a plane due to very cold air that the plane is traveling through. The filmmaker found this very puzzling, if it indeed is the case that the atmosphere at jetliner altitudes is astonishingly cold, wherein every flight would lower in altitude if cold caused that to happen. Jetliners fly in the upper troposphere or the tropopause in the 30 to 40,000 foot altitude range, which is what the populace of the world is told those planes have cruising altitudes at. But here you're looking at a page in Wikipedia about the temperature of the troposphere, and we unsurprisingly can see that the troposphere is far colder than 0 degrees Celsius in the area of the troposphere where jetliners fly, and 0 degrees Celsius being where it is taught to airline pilots is the temperature range and below which where constant altitude correction must be made, because planes lower in altitude due to cold temperature producing measurement defects in altitude wherein the planes lower, which means that the specific planes that are going to have this constant correction for altitude are the planes that fly the highest, the jetliners. But this is of course precisely what the Zetetic eye gyroscope model would predict, that the planes that are going the fastest, namely the jetliners, which will also be the ones claimed to need the greatest altitude correction since they are in the coldest area of flight. But the Zetetic eye gyroscope model would predict that these planes need constant altitude correction because they are going the fastest, and if they are traveling in a straight line with respect to the Earth plane that is embowed, they will lose altitude more and more as they progress in their flight path. Summing up in simpler words, the Zetetic eye gyroscope model predicts that planes actually lose altitude not due to temperature, but due to the embowed Earth plane slope. Another point to note about the embowed Earth plane is that places such as Australia and Ushuaia, South America, are going to be a bit closer than one might guess. In other words, the distance existing between South America and Australia would be quite a bit less. According to the Zetetic eye gyroscope model being discussed, since the embowment draws those two areas of the world closer to one another, and if a plane were to travel between the two, its flight time may not be quite as long as the average flat Earth model would involve. To the filmmaker's knowledge, these passenger jetliner flights that are nonstop and that supposedly go over Antarctica occur as overnight flights, and it is dark when the jetliner flies over Antarctica, supposedly. According to the Zetetic eye gyroscope model, what would be happening is that the jetliner is flying at a higher altitude across the embowed Earth plane, and the darkness of the overnight flight prevents the jetliner passenger from being precisely aware of their flight course that they are taking. It seems it would be the case that the jetliner would not fly a straight path from Australia to Santiago, Chile, because that would take the plane right across many big cities, which would be very visible. Instead, it is likely that the plane would take a curved route over the Pacific, would avoid flying over any continents. And instead, one would only be flying over the Pacific the entire flight. To the filmmaker's knowledge from people who have emailed that have supposedly taken this flight, they were told that part of the time the flight would be over Antarctica. It would appear to be the case that at the high altitude that the plane would take, that cities would nevertheless still not be visible if the plane took a route over the Pacific, due to the fact that the same light refractive properties that we just got done discussing for the sunset and for the illusion of curvature and the distance on the horizon would take effect and prevent jetliner passengers from seeing large cities in the United States, for example, in the distance. The filmmaker does not know if these speculations on the Qantas Flights 27, for example, are precisely how the flight actually works. The only point to bring this discussion up is to merely state that it seems very reasonable that it could work this way, where a passenger would think they're flying one direction over a tremendous expanse of ocean water rather than the other direction, also over a tremendous expanse of ocean water. If the distance between, for example, Australia and southern Chile were 1/3 or a quarter less than believed according to the standard flat Earth map, such as that you see on your screen right now, it would appear that a plane going merely 800 to 850 miles an hour could quite readily make the entire trip in about 12 hours across the Earth plane curved over the Pacific, seemingly without that significantly higher of an altitude involved than a normal jetliner. And this is, of course, how long that flight takes if one looks at flight records. Up to this point, we have discussed the sunset, explanations for gravity, the embowment of the Earth plane, and the illusion of lowering of objects in the distance on the horizon. It should be noted how well these aspects of the Zetetic eye gyroscope go together. For example, embowment causes the appearance of the sunset and objects sinking below the horizon in the far distance, creating the illusion of curvature. And note that the embowment is required in order for gravity to function properly and objects to fall straight down. Many other connections can be noted with this and additional information that is still yet to come in this documentary. But next we must address a very important issue, which can be summed up as follows. So, the Zetetic eye gyroscope model describes in flat Earth terms why there can be the illusion of the lowering of objects in the distance on the horizon, including the sun forming the sunset. However, the question may linger in a viewer's mind, where one may wonder, how do we know with absolute precision that the appearance of the sunset and the lowering of objects in the distance on the horizon is in fact due to light refraction, a trick of light, rather than a curvature of the surface of the Earth. In other words, a person listening to this documentary may wonder to themselves, well, okay, curvature would explain the lowering of objects and the distance on the horizon, and perhaps light refraction would also. How do I know which one is correct? And we are going to explore that next. We will find that light refraction is an empirical explanation for the phenomenon seen in the horizon and the sinking sunset, whereas the curvature of the Earth is a metaphysical, non-scientific explanation. So on that note, please watch the following clip from the first edition of the first volume of this Zeteticism series, which should conclusively show us that it is light refraction on a flat plane that is responsible for the lowering of objects in the distance. What this clip involves is a discussion of the flattest place on Earth, and what we will do is determine that it is actually geometrically flat, not just very smooth and curved, and we will find, even though it is geometrically flat, it has extreme instances of lowering of objects in the horizon, and the only explanation if this basin in South America is geometrically flat and it has lowering of objects in the distance in the horizon would be due to light refraction, not the curvature of the Earth. That is what we will embark on now. In this clip, I use the term gravitation and I also use the term gravity. I just do that for the sake of simplicity instead of describing the downward pull of objects in terms of centrifugal force. But in effect, what we are doing in this documentary is making gravitation simply centrifugal force. One is the other. Let's proceed with the clip. Here you go. Bottom of this, of which philosophical assumptions are correct in this lowering mathematics. Now, I'll just give you a hint. We're going to come to the conclusion that it's just refraction, but let's go through this step by step. To do this, we're going to take a quick aside to discuss an extremely interesting part of the world, the largest salt flat in the world located in Chile. It's called the Salar de Uyuni. If I mispronounce that, I apologize. And it is deemed to be the flattest place on planet Earth. It only varies by less than a meter in elevation differences, yet it's larger than many countries. Almost twice the size of Delaware, yet only about 80 or 90 centimeters of elevation difference across this huge expanse. Here's the Journal of Geophysical Research, volume 113, talking about how 80 centimeters difference in this entire area of difference of elevation. Now, what do we mean by flatness? Those who hold the flat earth philosophy are going to say what we mean by flatness is it's flat like a geometrical plane, approximately. It doesn't involve a curvature, such as on a spherical globe. And of course, those who hold the round earth philosophy are going to say, no, it's flatness in that it curves with the earth's curvature, but there's less than a meter elevation differences along that curvature. The Salar de Uyuni is a drainage basin for the surrounding mountains, and it can be covered with quite a bit of water for many months at a time. Here you can see people walking in the small bit of water that appears to be still. Now we'll see some videos shortly where it's not still, it is flowing, but most photographic information about the Salar shows water very still because it's a flat surface. So here's somebody driving through it. This is very common for people to do. People even ride motorcycles through the water. Now this is what we want to focus on, is the water covering. And what we're going to suggest here is that on a curved surface, the Salar cannot be completely covered with water. The water would have to go towards the edges, as these arrows point. If there's an observer at A and an observer at B, at two ends of the Salar, then the water would gradually flow to one or the other, because it could not stay stationary on the curved surface. If you hold the round earth philosophy, you may state that no, that's not the case. The water can stay stationary on a curved flat surface because gravitational pull is curved, as this picture illustrates. Okay, so the water will stay stationary. That idea would have to also be the case for the curvature of the water from Portage, Indiana to the Sears Tower. That's 500-foot hump of water. Somebody could assert that water surface is dictated by gravitation, and the gravitational pull to the center of the Earth is curved on a curved sphere, so therefore there's no problem in stating that there's a curved surface of Lake Michigan. So the Salar and Lake Michigan would have similar philosophy here, where the Earth's curvature on the round Earth philosophy has its curved or arced gravitational pull direction, therefore water surfaces would be curved, and the Salar could have a curved surface with stationary water on it as well. The problem with that would appear to be found in the following illustration. Imagine if you had a plate of metal that you leveled perfectly on the surface of the Earth. Let's say it was either perfectly flat, like a geometrical plane, roughly speaking, for the sake of the thought experiment, or let's say it had a curve to it, which wouldn't be seen with the naked eye, but was a curve that perfectly matched the curve of the Earth according to the round Earth philosophy. Now, according to this idea that water will keep its positioning, we should be able to stack up some water, maybe a millimeter high or an inch high or something, where if gravity just pulls down properly, then everything can stay in position. Let me restate that in different words. If water is to stay in position on the salar across the curve, say an inch or a foot or whatever thick it happens to be, then there has to be a mechanism which dictate that it does so. Obviously the mechanism is going to be gravity. The arced gravitation, and the arc will hold water in place on the curved gravitational or arced gravitational pull from the center of the Earth will keep water in place across the curve of the salar. Okay, so we'll have water stacked up across a hump, just in analogous to the way that water will stack up from Portage, Indiana to the Sears Tower, 500 feet high. We can mimic this by using either a leveled flat sheet of metal, or let's say hypothetically we can make one that is curved slightly, mimicking the curve of the Earth. So we should be able to stack up water. If gravitation is what we have holding water in place, if gravitation is holding water in place, then it would hold water in place on the metal plate as well. But I think we all know that you can all do this experiment yourself, find the flattest surface you can, and I think we'll all see that when we try to pile the water up, it'll flow to the side. The definition of a liquid is that it flows and will therefore fit into its container that it flows within. Say that water is going to stand up without conforming to its container violates the definition of what a liquid is. That's what's required for this big hump of water to happen in Lake Michigan, or it to stay in position in the salar. You could do this for a flat plane too. And we all know that all that's going to be left is some water droplets on the surface, because the outward flow force, represented by these red arrows, is going to overcome what we call gravity, this downward motion. So the same should apply to the salar. It's just, instead of over the course of it, let's say that water blob I just drew was an inch across or something, let's say instead we've got the size of the salar, which is still significantly less than the size of the sphere Earth and the round philosophy. No, so looking at the picture of the salar here again, I don't see how all of a sudden the situation is different. Yeah, we've got a larger distance, but who cares? Our thought experiment we just did we allowed for a flat surface. We didn't even have the curve that the salar picture shows here. And we still know that the flow characteristics of water will be violated. But if the salar is going to have standing water all across it here in this picture, somewhere or another we're going to violate the definitions of a liquid, and we're going to have water piling up where it doesn't conform to its container. And that, unfortunately, for the round philosophy, violates my empirical experience that I've had of liquids probably every day of my life since I've been born. So it would probably be wiser to stick with the empirical experience I've had of liquids conforming to their containers, rather than suddenly rejecting all that empirical experience in order to adopt the theoretical idea that water can bunch up in humps and stand on flat surfaces and so forth, because it's just so I can hold the round Earth philosophy. Somewhere or another in the salar, if you hold to this idea that water can stay standing in the middle, you are suggesting that the flow characteristics of water can be violated, and that water can pile up in such a way where it won't flow, such as from the top here, it won't flow to the sides. If it doesn't stand up on the curved plate that's curved in this ideal thought example to the surface of the Earth, it won't stand up in the center of the salar either. If it flows to the sides on the plate, it flows to the sides in the salar as well. They're the same situation, except different scales, which is negligible. But what this means is, if the salar has water standing, if it only differs, if it's basically a flat surface and only differs by 80 centimeters or so, then that means it can't have significant water spanning the entire thing if it's on a curved surface. So if it does have standing water for significant periods of time, then the salar is a flat surface, sort of in the same manner of a geometrical plane, not a curved surface, which is called flat because it has few elevation differences on a spherical surface. Now it really is flat as well. If you look at these pictures, you can see you can see here people riding motorcycles very fast because that's how flat it is. And here's a picture of somebody riding. You can ride a motorcycle through the water. The water often forms a thin layer. So we can verify that the salar is geometrically flat, not smooth on a curved surface. This doesn't prove the Earth is flat or something. This is just about the salar. Now, the same arguments apply for the curved, humped water between Whiting, Illinois and the Sears Tower. And I don't know how the round Earth philosophy would get around that, because the exact same principles are going to apply. So what we're saying here is humping water seems to quite clearly violate the flow qualities of a liquid, which we all can empirically verify as many times as we want every day. So this would be a major problem for the round Earth philosophy, because this is not complicated evidence. We're not talking about murky mathematics that can only be verified by somebody in a satellite or in the International Space Station or something. No, we're talking about the qualities of a liquid. Does it flow or does it not flow? If it's a liquid, it flows. A liquid on the metal plate will flow. Yes, you can have one drop that has surface tension, but we're talking about larger quantities of water, such as, a couple centimeters or half a foot or something, as the salar has. So this isn't tough evidence. This isn't something obscure. It's just about liquids. The most basic principles of liquids is what we're using here as our evidence. The flow characteristics of a liquid, which we've all understood when we were about 6 months old, probably. So this is not anything mysterious here, what we're talking about. So some of you might say that, well, no, what probably happens is there's puddles, big puddles in the salar. This area will have a flat basin, and that area will have a flat basin, kind of like a golf ball, and it'll have some pockets which accumulate water, and therefore the whole thing really isn't covered. It's just pockets here and there, and so many pockets that it just seems like it's covered. I've never been to the salar, but that is not the finding that I'm seeing. People talk about who have been to the salar. It seems to be universally discussed that the salar will be completely covered in some years, and often for many months at a time. Here's the Journal of Geophysical Research, that same article we were talking about earlier. Scroll down a number of pages. It says here, the depth of inundation is quite variable from year to year, with the surface remaining nearly dry in some years and completely flooded for several months in others. Okay, so they're not saying puddles here and there, they're saying completely flooded. Now, I saw news stories. Sometimes there are warnings because there's so much water in the salar. A foot or two of water. It happened one time, I think in 2012 it was. Listen to this fella.
Made it to the famous salt flats of Bolivia, and it's so much better than I expected. It's so beautiful here. It's 12,000 square kilometers, and this used to be one big giant lake, and it's the rainy season now, so there's a bit of water on there, but it's so beautiful. It's even more.
Everybody discusses that as if it's completely covered. And here's just a blog post I came across. Somebody commenting, talking about how people don't know if they can bicycle across it because it's completely covered with water at times. Everybody, here's a tourist site talking about it just being covered. This doesn't say completely covered, but it doesn't say partially covered. I never saw anywhere it said that it was partially covered. I looked all over. It being completely covered for long periods of time is absolutely standard, which would be, again, a significant piece of evidence that the salar is geometrically flat. And here we can see somebody who's not very close to the edge, because they're out from those mountains quite a bit. It would seem they're not too close to the edge, but yet there's a seemingly steady, stationary bit of water. Looks like there's some ripples there. Maybe that's from somebody walking. The flow, though, doesn't look like ripples like that. A flow, we're going to show a picture of a flow in just a moment. Right here is a flow. That almost looks like wind blowing on the water. To be honest, I'm not really sure. I have this in fast motion, so it doesn't take so long. Now here's someone who gives us almost a panoramic view. You can see they're not anywhere near the edge, going all the way around, and yet there's stationary water. So this is just verification of what we've been reading here. Now, one more thing I just want to point out before we move on. Now, here's the Salar at night. Absolutely amazing. Look at the stars there. Now, see, this is one thing that the Flat Earth Camp is wondering about, I believe. It's well known that when you go up in elevation, stars become much more visible, in a stunning way. Go to Rocky Mountain National Park and look up, and you'll see it looks a whole lot different than your backyard. Now, a lot of times people say, "Oh no, that's because there's less light pollution as the cities." But no, you can go in the middle of the country in a low elevation, then go up at Rocky Mountain National Park, for example, and you see a big difference in places where there's not a lot of light pollution. Now, whether you're low or high. But this is why telescopes are placed on high elevations. So the point here is that this is one thing that really has the Flat Earth philosophy group irked, is that if you're in space, you should have the clearest view of stars. It should be amazing how vivid and bright they are. Just from our evidence of when we go up in elevation to telescopic levels here on planet Earth. But yet, the NASA pictures we have all have no stars. Okay? And to my experience, it seems that the round Earth philosophy camp thinks it's absolutely ridiculous that the Flat Earth camp has some trouble with this. Here's a picture of the International Space Station. You know, there's the curved Earth. There it is, orbiting. Where are the stars? There should be an incredible array of stars there. Where are they? Now, I've been told that I'm absolutely stupid for asking this question, but I don't think so. I think this is, whether you're a conspiracy theorist or you're an academic, this doesn't make any sense. Okay? It's sort of silly that I have to point this out. But this picture here of the International Space Station, it does not make any sense. Where is the background? I'm a bit baffled. Here we see this in the Salar. Yeah, with this International Space Station we see nothing. There's a serious problem here. So if the Salar is indeed geometrically flat rather than, there are a number of significant problems that the existence of this geometrically flat Salar poses to the round Earth philosophy camp, which I'll go through quickly. First of all, it's unclear how in a spherical world with arced gravitational pull, how can something nearly geometrically flat come into existence? It's almost like saying nature created something with a straight edge, which is difficult to fathom. Usually geometries in nature are jagged and fractal and so forth. This is problematical that this Salar exists, because the gravitation in the center of the Salar will be stronger. The gravitational pull will be stronger in the center of the Salar as the edges, since the edges would be further away from the center of the Earth according to the round philosophy. So what force in nature has allowed the edges of the Salar to be being kept from being pulled down? What force resisted gravity to make the Salar geometrically flat? Now add to this that scientists, to my knowledge, hold the philosophy that the Salar is created and conforms to a salty ocean underneath it. And it is structured by gravity, and it should have the same curvature that a water surface would. They call it a geoid. So again, if this is all the case, then somebody has to explain how water can perform what would seem to be roughly magical qualities in the salar in violating their flow characteristics. So what we want to do, and the reason we're discussing the salar, is because we want to know if it has any significant lowering of some of the mountains along the edges. If the salar is geometrically flat, then we should see from great distances much less significant lowering as we did, for example, with the Sears Tower, where just at 30 miles we had 500 feet of lowering. So if the salar does not have curvature and happens to be a flat surface on a curved sphere, we should see significantly less lowering. However, if we do see significant lowering, this has a significant conclusion to it, which is that in a geometrical plane there can be significant light refraction, which would have to be investigated to see if it's significant enough where it can mimic what's happening with the Sears Tower. Because if in this flat surface we have refraction in that sort of amount, that means that refraction can account for the lowering of objects on the horizon to the extent where it can account for the lowering of the Sears Tower, and therefore only light refraction would be needed to account for the lowering of objects on the horizon, not curvature. So you might want to play that last minute back so you can get all these points set in your mind as we go forward. Here's Mount Tanupa on the edge, famous mountain on the edge of the salar. That's 93% of a mile over the base of the salar. Very tall. Okay, so here's this picture. Let me expand it out a bit. And let's compare it to another picture, the picture we were just looking at. And what we find, if we compare the two, I don't know how tall how high up on that flag is. I don't know if we're looking at water level and we're close up, or if we're out at a distance and we're way up high. Looking at amount, I'm not really sure. It doesn't really matter. The point is that the picture on the right and the picture on the left have a different horizon. The picture on the right is significantly lowered on the horizon. Let's match the features of these mountains up. See right there, they're matched up properly. They both don't look that. Looks like the one on the left is closer, but the one on the right, you can still make out a lot of the features. But yet there's that much difference in the horizon. Now that's almost a mile in height, that mountain. So you're not looking at a small amount of distance there. There's the portion cut off. That's close up. And that you're looking at from the sand there to the top, you're looking at 93% of a mile. The Mount Tanupa extends 1,500 meters over the salar, over 90% of a mile. That means that there's about 25% of the horizon cut off in the picture on the right, which isn't even that far away. So there's significant lowering going on. In the picture on the left, we're not even at the mountain yet. In the picture on the left, I don't even think we see the base yet. We're probably pretty close. I'm going to assume we're in that picture on the left, we're basically at the base, but that's one thing we don't know. But let's ignore that for right now. So you're talking about 25% lowering. Now, I don't know how that can be, if you think back to the Sears Tower example, where from 30 miles away, 500 feet of lowering. So the point here is we don't have just some simple percent of the sort of lowering that we saw with the Sears Tower, viewed from Whiting. But here we're seeing a huge amount of lowering, about 20% of a mile, which is 1,000 feet, twice as much as we saw from 30 miles away with the Sears Tower. Twice as much. So I believe I have no choice but to move to the conclusion here that light refraction is the sole factor in accounting for the lowering of the Sears Tower viewed from Whiting, Illinois. I do not know how I am to avoid that conclusion with what I'm seeing here from the solar. To sum up, because if the solar can have this much light refraction viewed from the distance of that picture on the right of Mount Tanupa, then I have no choice but to conclude that light refraction is all it's accounting for with the Sears Tower. Because, to repeat, because with the solar we're ignoring the curvature factor, because we found that the solar is geometrically flat due to our study of water flow properties and when water covers the solar completely. So you might have to rewind this and play this over and think about this again, but the solar appears to lead us to the conclusion that the lowering of the Sears Tower on the horizon, viewed from a distance across Lake Michigan, is being caused by light refraction. The Zetetic eye gyroscope may also be able to empirically explain the existence of the northern and southern star trails. What these star trails are the axis points of the inside of the dome as the gyroscope turns 1 revolution per day. This is a very complicated issue, and at the time of the making of this documentary, there were more than one scenarios that seemed to fit the description for how the star trails could appear in the sky as they do. And therefore, rather than include this information in this documentary, instead, a future volume of this documentary series is being planned and is underway that is intended to empirically describe the nature of the star trails. Another issue that the Zetetic eye gyroscope may explain is the ocean currents, and namely the large gyres that the oceans allegedly make, and as you are seeing on your screen right now. As a gyroscope precesses, the edges, namely where the earth plane would exist on the side of the gyroscope with the centrifugal force pushing outward, would comprise a back and forth rocking up and down motion. What the filmmaker did is composed a bowl experiment with a set of partitions inside of it, where the bowl is intended to mimic the Zetetic eye gyroscope. The partitions represent the land or continent barriers, and the ocean would hopefully imitate the Zetetic eye gyroscope to some degree, being deeper in the central areas and shallow towards the edges. The bowl is also circular, as it would appear the Zetetic eye earth plane would be as well. More specifically, what is meant by that is the ocean parts of the earth plane would comprise a circularity. What the filmmaker did is shredded some pieces of finely ground cilantro and moved the bowl in a way that you are seeing now, which is intended to imitate the way the earth plane would move on the side of the Zetetic eye gyroscope as it precessed. And interestingly, the same figure-8 sorts of motions with the same current orientations appeared in the bowl experiment. Please watch for a moment as a few of these are demonstrated for you. Here are some of the conclusions of this bowl experiment. The experiment seems to resemble the way ocean currents would be on the flat Earth map as derived from the ball Earth map and the way the Pacific and Atlantic and Indian Oceans gyrate. The experiment is of course limited to the lack of knowledge of the exact nature and structure of the Zetetic eye gyroscope, if that is the correct model of the flat Earth system. Next, we will show some different sorts of motions with the Zetetic eye gyroscope bowl construction to show that non-gyroscopic motions, as just performed, give rise to patterns of water current in the bowl that do not at all resemble the ocean current gyres. More simply put, it is by the gyroscopic imitation just performed which gives rise to the mimicry of the gyres in the bowl experiment as in the ocean, and other bowl motions do not appear to. Please watch the following few demonstrations to show that different non-gyroscopic sorts of motions do not appear to give rise to the proper pattern imitating the oceans. Please note that in the last experiment you'll see a black colored bowl rather than the glass bowl. The black colored bowl has a different shape and non-spherical structure, giving rise to apparently an asymmetry with the Zetetic eye gyroscope structure. The word gyre seems to appear in a shortened form in the word gyroscope. Perhaps an investigation into the word history will reveal some correlation or tie between the ocean currents and the gyroscopic motion of the Earth plane that apparently is taking part if the evidence of this video is correct. Also notice that in the NH inner circle, the gyres go in a clockwise motion, and in the SH outer ring, they go in a counterclockwise motion. This could explain why purportedly drains drain in opposite directions in each of the two so-called hemispheres in the heliocentric model, which we are calling the inner circle and the outer ring in our Zetetic eye gyroscope and bowed plane model. To the filmmaker's knowledge, it's very difficult to verify if drains in fact are such that in the SH outer circle they go counterclockwise when the bathtub drains, for example, and in the NH inner circle they go clockwise. However, if that is the case and that is what they do, it could be explained by the gyroscopic motion, which apparently may cause the ocean currents, since the gyres move in the same fashion clockwise in the NH inner circle and counterclockwise in the SH outer ring. The experiments the filmmaker has seen online where people try to verify this show an incredibly slow progression of turning of draining liquid. Perhaps further investigation can empirically verify that the Zetetic eye gyroscope's motions, just as they cause the ocean currents, also cause these drain patterns, which mimic each other. If the Zetetic model for physical reality is correct, that means that physical reality is created by an intelligence, rather than being something that evolved undirected by any sort of mental capacity, and rather only by the forces of nature that are discussed in scientific circles. It would not be entirely surprising in the case of where the Zetetic model was correct and an intelligence was responsible for the existence of the system. It would not be terribly surprising to find out that the system was a spherical gyroscope, due to the fact that if one looks to the heavens and looks at the planets and other heavenly bodies, they seem to move in gyroscopic rotations in so many cases. So it's almost expected that our overall system would also be gyroscopic.